Okay, so when I was a young PhD student, I attended my very first meeting of the SSR in Boston, and I was intrigued by the rather shocking title of the plenary address by Benton Johnson, who was the president of the time. It was called Religion and Child Abuse, Perfect Together. So I thought of calling my paper something like that, but I decided not to. Well, first of all, I wanted to say that children are a natural symbol, to use Mary Douglas's term, that is found in the rhetoric and prophetic literature of millennial groups. The child is an apt and powerful symbol of hope for a better utopian future, also a symbol of suffering and deprivation in the present, and nostalgia for the past. Thus, the child is a symbol for the whole group, the sectarian community that finds itself caught between the competing tensions of nostalgia and futurity. Debbie Olson writes in her editor's intro to The Child in Post-Apocalyptic Cinema that the child occupies a unique space within the narrative, a space that oscillates between death and destruction, faith and hope. By exploring the ways children function discursively within a dystopian framework, we may better understand how and why traditional notions of childhood are repeatedly tethered to sites of adult conflict and disaster, a connection that often functions to reaffirm the rightness of past social order. Olson might have been writing about children in contemporary millenarian movements that are the focus of my presentation today. Movements that award children a central role in what scholars would call their millennial vision or end-time expectations, and what the media would refer to as the cult's apocalyptic agenda. In many millennial groups, as in post-apocalyptic cinema, the child defines the lost past, present, and becomes a motivational, almost sacred image to spur on a reclamation of the future. In the utopian dreams of some of the prophetic movements we'll be looking at, the child plays a central role in their hopes for the survival of humanity. And a few of these intentional societies, what Cantor describes as communal utopias, children were the sacrificial victims or the collateral damage resulting from dystopian dreams and administrations. So what I'm doing in this paper is as follows. I've chosen 6 groups, which might all be described as world-rejecting NRMs in the Irish scholar Roy Wallace's typology. And they're millenarian, sectarian. So the 6 groups are the Solar Temple, known as the OTS, Ordre de Temple Solaire in French, founded in the 70s, lasted into the 90s in Europe, Quebec, and Martinique. Move, known to members as On a Move, founded in 1972 in the city of Philadelphia and still going strong. The Oneida community, which existed for about maybe 30 years in New York States in the mid-1800s. The 12 tribes, founded in 1974 in Tennessee, then moved to Vermont and is now an international commune. The Doukhobors, in Russian, spirit wrestlers, originated in the 17th, and some scholars think as early as the 16th century in Russia. Then they migrated to Western Canada in 1900 because they refused to go to war under the Bolsheviks. And finally, Echo V, which was founded by a Quebec man who claimed to be a Micmac shaman and chief in Quebec, and then moved to France, Belgium, and Finland. This is a field that's not very well researched. There are problems, of course, researching children because of the takeover of the research ethics boards in North America. And the groups don't keep very good records of their experiments in child rearing. Of course, they're mostly oral traditions anyway. And of course, they don't want social workers and outsiders to know about everything they're up to. And some of the best records we have are memoirs written by people who grew up in new religions. And a wonderful example is Krishnamurti, who is the avatar or the world teacher of the Theosophical Society. And another wonderful book is Boyhood with Gurdjieff, written by Fitz Peters, describing his life in Fontainebleau under the crazy wisdom Gnostic teacher Gurdjieff. So I'm going to start with the solar temple, which I first heard about this group. I never heard about this group till my mother phoned me on the morning of October 84 and said, early in the morning, said, "Sue, you better go get the newspapers." She reads the newspapers very, very early. So I ran out, and sure enough, I was getting phone calls from the media. I'd never heard about the group. So I just said, I had nothing to say. And then I heard all these stupid people on the radio saying, yes, just like David Koresh of the Brecht Divisions. So I decided I better learn something quick. So I started answering phone calls, pretending I'd researched the group, and I was sitting on a mine of knowledge. So then the journalists started swapping bits of information with me, and I had a notebook and I got quite a lot of information. I started swapping, and I discovered there's this huge divide between the French and the English journalists who were at war, you know, competing. So, and then actually the result of that was the police came to see me at my office at Dawson College because they thought that I was, you know, sitting on all this information on this criminal gang. And anyway, so it was quite dramatic. Actually, I didn't research them nearly enough, and the research has been quite not very deep. Recently, there have been several books that came out in the year 2000s, memoirs of ex-members, which have a lot more material about the ritual life. For example, by Charles Doukhobors, actually I'll have to look up his name, and other people. So now the solar temple is very interesting for this topic of children and violence in millenarian movements, because it's probably the most dramatic example of a group where children had an important millenarian role, and even some of them messianic roles, and their deaths were specifically linked to the ideology of the group and their millenarian beliefs. There's a list here of child victims that appeared in one of the books. First of all, now you can tell the way they were killed what their status was in the group. So the Antichrist was a 3-year-old whose birth was seen as a threat to the main leader, Joe DiMambro, because he was named Emmanuel, which was the sacred name of Joe DiMambro's daughter, who was supposed to be a boy. And also the father of the son was seen as a traitor because he discovered some of the fake visual effects that were happening in the temple using lasers and things like that. So he was ritually killed in Morin Heights, Quebec, and also his parents were killed. And the 2 Templars who killed them committed suicide by burning the chateau next door, the chalet, sorry. Now the second category were traitors. There were three categories of people who died in the solar temple mass suicide or transit, as they understood it. There were the awakened ones, who were the leaders who chose to get rid of their bodies so that they could travel to the dwarf star Sirius, which was their home. They believed they were immortal Templars, the same souls who died with Jacques de Molay, you know, in the Middle Ages. And then there were the immortals, who were members and children who were considered to be spiritually evolved and reincarnated spiritual beings from other times in history. Some of them were Egyptian pharaohs, some were people in the prophets in the Bible, or Templars. And so they were gently helped without their knowledge to join in this mass suicide. And third, there were the traitors, mostly Quebecers, who had challenged Joe de Montbreau, the Grand Master's leadership, and were asking their money back and talking to the media and so on. And they were tricked into a meeting in Switzerland where they were promised they'd get their money back, and then they were trapped in the chalet and shot in the head, and the chalet was burned down. And the chalet next door, which was in Salvin, was where the awakened ones and the immortals died. And so you see the 4 children who were immortals were sedated and then burned, whereas the traitor children were shot in the head just like their parents. They were the children of the parents who were considered traitors. And then later, a few months later, no, actually a year later, in Vercours, France, sorry, it's Vercours, I put the U in by mistake, they found 16 people who died in a ritualistic fashion around a fire in the woods, and 3 of them were children of probably the police officer who killed everyone and then killed himself. And the idea of that mass suicide was it was sort of a copy transit so they could join their community on Sirius. But we don't really know. There's a lot of different theories, conspiracy theories too, about that second mass suicide. Okay, now there are many patterns in the family patterns and patterns of sexuality in the movement that I feel contributed to the killing of the children. First of all, some of the children had messianic roles. The leader, Joseph de Montbreau, who was the Grand Master, had an affair with a young, beautiful member, Dominique, and they had this baby together called Emmanuel, but he staged a public magical conception in the temple in which this actually sort of a puppet who represented one of the ascended masters and pointed a sword at Emmanuel, and her throat lit up, and that was supposed to be the moment when she conceived the child. The other child was called Emmanuel, and he was born in Quebec, and he was labeled the Antichrist because the parents conceived the child without the leader's permission, and they named him a charismatic name that competed with, Emmanuel, who was the cosmic Christ. Now Emmanuel was supposed to be a boy, and she was raised as a boy. She was seen as androgynous. And once you start reading about the rituals of the group, there was the actually quite common ritual of Adam and Eve being androgynous before they were separated. And so the ideal person is male and female. And there was an emphasis on the couples coming together and sort of reenacting the first person before the separation into Adam and Eve and so on. And she was raised amidst rituals of purity. She wasn't allowed to play with other children. She had to engage in parallel play, throwing balls and balloons while the children had to be 10 meters apart. And even, by the way, there were 2 antichrists. And when the first little boy who was the Antichrist came to visit her, it was really hard keeping him away because he naturally wanted to rush up to her and grab her ball and so on. And they had to really explain, you can't touch her, she's very pure. She was also, actually I have that a bit later, I'll explain that. Now, the cosmic couples were magical couples whose sex life was supposed to provide enormous energy to the planet and help save the planet from destruction. And the leader, Di Mambro, was always breaking them up and rematching them, and he would tell them, "Votre couple a fini son cycle karmique." So your couple has finished its karmic cycle. You better, get this new partner. And he would give them reincarnated identities and send them on a mission. And so here this is rather a crude little chart I've done where that funny symbol there is there's a breakup of a married couple, and then one of the partners gets together with a new person. Here it's Luc Jouret, and so if you read the book by Thierry Huguenin, who wrote a book called The 54th, he believed he was supposed to be the 54th Templar to die because they're trying to recreate the medieval massacre of the Templars. And he describes tremendous amount of wife swapping and reconfiguring of couples in the group. There were also quite remarkable age discrepancies in the cosmic couples. Joseph was 25 years older than his wife Jocelyne. Nathalie, who was the wife of Thierry Huguenin, who wrote the book, she was taken away from him and given to Joseph de Mandro's son, who was only 15, and she was 32. Then Mercier and Patricia were 35 years apart, the man older, and the same with René and Brigitte. Now, children were integrated into the ritual life of the OTS, and they played a prominent part in their rituals. And Joseph de Mandre was constantly awarding new charismatic identities to people. So some of them had quite a string of identities. He was Moses. Dominique Belleton was the Pharaoh Hatshepsut. Luc Jouret was Saint Bernard and Jesus, and so on. And the children also had charismatic identities. There's an interesting reference in one of the books to Christophe Di Mambro, who was the eldest son of Joseph Di Mambro, and he was thought to be the soulless one. He was just a body without a soul, waiting for his father to die, and then his father's soul would jump into his body, which is kind of a creepy way to see your own child. I mean, I'm sure my children would not appreciate that. And his younger son, Sébastien, was called the prophet Eli because he was conceived in one of the caves in Jerusalem. Now here you have a picture of Di Mambro training the little Emmanuel, the magical cosmic Christ, in magical techniques. So he would give her a sword and she would point it at a door or window and say, "Ouvrez!" And then he would press a little button under his cloak and it would open up. And so she thought she had magical powers. And here are the Dutois in Quebec with their little 3-year-old who was denounced as the Antichrist. Now, there's also an interesting transit that happened in 1997, 3 years later, in which 3 teenagers almost died but managed to escape. And this is in Saint-Casimir, Quebec, in a very, the coldest day of March. Their parents were the Kezes, who had been part of the Saint-Anne-de-Pérade bakery and survivalist commune near Quebec. And they had missed out on the first mass suicide, so they decided to follow. And on March 21, they and the mother of the mother of Didier's wife, the mother of the Kez, tried to include their 3 children in a copycat transit. The little girl, who was 14, woke up in the middle of the night having to go to the bathroom, and she smelled a terrible smell of gas. So she went to the kitchen, turned off all the gas, then she went to the bathroom, and she noticed there was a bomb, but it had failed to go off. So she woke up her brothers, and in the morning they confronted the parents, who said, "You're staying home from school," and they spent the whole day negotiating, At the end of the day, the parents said, all right, you don't have to come to Sirius if you insist, because the children were very interested in the school play and the hockey game coming up that they're participating and so on. And they hadn't really had much to do with the solar temples since 1994, you know. So the parents gave them sleeping pills and made them sleep in the garden shed at the far end of the garden. And then in the early hours of the morning, the chalet blew up, killing the 5 adults. And the children were sent to France to live with their grandfather. And a really interesting article appeared recently in which some journalists tracked down the oldest son, Tom Kez, and interviewed him. And he's now living in Le Havre, and he's working in a bakery, just like his father did. And he talks about that episode. He says he doesn't blame his parents, and he's got over it and moved on, and so on. So here's a picture of the house in Saint Casimir that was burnt, and the bomb that didn't go off. Now, looking at the violence towards the children in the solar temple, there seem to be several factors. First of all, there were the shifting charismatic identities and revelations of previous incarnations, which came to de Montbro through the 33 brothers or frères in Zurich. And de Montbro, it seems to be, well, he was an old Rosicrucian and also a Franc-Maçon Mason. So he seems to have borrowed the ascended master notion from Blavatsky. Then there was the attenuation of family ties. Children were taken away from parents and given to other couples. And they had a system of eugenics where Joseph would tell a couple, you have to have a child now, and they would be sent to an isolated chalet and observe certain purity rituals and try to conceive a child. And if they didn't succeed, they'd have to split up and go with someone else. Then there were abrupt divagations in their apocalyptic trajectory. They seemed to switch from being survivalists. After all, they did found a farm in Saint-Anne-de-Parade, Quebec, that was supposed to be a survivalist shelter, and Quebec was supposed to be a safe place when the end of the world happened because of its granite bedrock. But then they became catastrophic premillennialists, saying that it's too late, you know, the end of the world is coming, let's get out of here, you know, let's bail out. So they moved from being post-tribbers, what the late Tom Robbins used to call post-tribbers and pre-tribbers, tribulationists, to you know, wanting to disappear before the tribulation. Some other reasons that have been given were they were being persecuted. In the studies of millennial groups by Catherine Wessinger and John Hall, they put a big emphasis on persecution, that the leaders decided to, you know, attack society or commit mass suicide because their religious goal was being threatened by persecution. But if you actually look at what happened to the Solar Temple, the persecution was mild. I mean, I've studied other groups that have weathered intense persecution. For example, the 12 tribes who had all their children taken away several times, which I can't imagine a more traumatic, you know, kind of persecution. And so I'm not so sure about that. And they also experienced repeated failure of prophecy. They were expected to ascend from Ayers Rock. The survivalist project in Quebec was being threatened by, basically the Quebecois members went on this Quebecois nationaliste trip of saying, we're Quebecers, you're French people, get out, you know. Then the police thwarted a 1993 transit plant by raiding the temple in Saint-Sauveur, Quebec in 1993. So it's possible that also contributed. But of course, we don't really know how literally they understood these transits to be. And that's one of the problems in studying millenarian movements, that when you talk to members about their leaders' prophecies, they can go from a whole spectrum of, oh, it's just a metaphor and it was just an idea at the time, to it's literally true, we better get ready. And you find that, of course, in the solar temple too. Finally, there was no way of predicting the danger to children from an outsider point of view, or even from an insider point of view, because most of the victims who died in 1994, in October, had no idea they were walking into a mass suicide. They thought it was a business meeting, and they brought their children with them. So it was a secret plan of de Montbro, between him and Luc Jouret and some of the women. Luc, by the way, Joe de Montbro had 3 wives who were considered to be 3 separate parts of the same elevated soul. And so, so anyway, the point is, it's really impossible in most cases for authorities to predict these violent events or know when children are in danger. Okay, I'm going to move on to my next group. This is a different type of violence because it was perpetrated by the state. And this is the case of Move in Philadelphia, 1985. Move was a radical anarchist commune. It's often been described as a political back-to-nature group, but it was also religious. I interviewed the leader, and the one person who survived the bombing, Ramona Africa, and she told me it was a religion, and they worshiped the Mother Earth. And the leader, the founder, John Africa, definitely had a millenarian vision in which he saw society as being completely corrupted, and the Earth, the planet, was being destroyed by technology and overpopulation and the cruel treatment to animals. And he had a vision of reclaiming nature in the middle of the city. So his followers used to go around tearing up the tarmac so that the earth could breathe and plants could grow. And they adopted up to 40 stray dogs and cats who lived with them. And they rejected plastic and garbage bags, so they would just, and also all their plumbing, their water and gas was cut off because they wouldn't pay their bills. So they were just going to the bathroom in the park or on the street. And the neighbors were, of course, grossed out and angry. And then the other thing that made them bad neighbors is they would scream through these loudspeakers all day, standing on the veranda. They were living in a little cozy row house, where they're like the ones in England, a series of row houses. And they would stand there yelling and screaming, "Motherfucker!" like in every sentence, and full of obscenities, profanities, and blasting the system, and mostly what they would demonstrate outside zoos to liberate the animals. And their philosophy seemed to be that everything in nature has to move and has to be free and follow its own course. And if you don't have movement and freedom, you have destruction and death. And so they wanted the animals to be free and people to be free and so on. They were also strict vegetarians, and they were vegans, and their children could only eat raw food. So the bombing happened in May 13, 1985, ordered by the mayor, who was also a black man, to drop 2 bombs on the row house in Osgood Avenue. The purpose was to destroy the fortress. Sorry, I thought I was going to give this talk in the afternoon, so I thought I'd have a chance to check my spelling. On the rooftop. They built this sort of bunker fortress on the rooftop that they would patrol with guns. And of course the neighbors were kind of alarmed, and then they would yell out, things. But 4 hours after the fire was extinguished, 61 houses were razed to the ground, and only 2 members escaped, Ramona and a 13-year-old boy. And the other 11 members were killed, including 5 children. And despite investigations and formal apologies, there were no criminal charges against the authorities who caused these deaths. John Africa was an illiterate man who dictated his philosophy to a social worker who wrote it up in a book called The Guidelines. And unfortunately, it's a secret book. Nobody's allowed to read it. They have released a few paragraphs, but they're afraid it'll be misused by the system. And in this book, he preaches against technology and in favor of animal rights, and also strict vegetarianism, raw food. Though the adults were allowed to eat cooked food, but not the children. And he was called our coordinator. Ramona is the only person who survived. I interviewed her. She's an amazing, dynamic social activist, and she's very powerful now because she's invited to UNESCO and all sorts of important places, and she also inherited millions from the disaster. Now she claims that the bomb was deliberately dropped to kill the children because they were only the only pure MOVE members raised outside the system. Therefore, they were seen as a threat to the social order. So the children were seen as pure and perfect, which is a theme you find running through all these groups. In fact, Eilen's PhD student Amanda wrote an amazing book called Perfect Children. Amanda, she has a long Dutch name, Van Dijmer van Twist or something. And she emphasizes this idea that children are supposed to be free of sin, pure, and you find this theme running through all these groups. Here we have pictures. Oh, the other thing is that children were always naked because they're supposed to be close to nature like the animals. And so that's another thing that bothered the neighbors. But there was a big outcry after the destruction of a whole neighborhood, and there was a lot of support for the move from people in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia became known as the city that bombs itself. Now, a very interesting point was made by this scholar who wrote an amazing book called Discourse and Dispute, the city of Philadelphia versus MOVE. And she looks at the rhetoric and the language used, and she's in the report, or the commission, that did the investigation of the fire and the deaths. She found a big discussion. There were records of a discussion in the meeting of the police with the mayor before they decided to bomb the house. And one of the police was saying, they're just kids. And the neighbors saw the children as naked famine victims, because they had distended bellies. And some people saw them as feral animals. The children behaved just like the dogs and cats. They were wild in the middle of a civilization. And the police were concerned that they were potential hostages. If they tried to arrest the members, they would use their children as hostages. And some police said the kids are trained guerrilla soldiers. We have to be careful, they're dangerous. We don't want to protect them, they're dangerous. And so the idea that children were terrorists. Now, Birdie Africa escaped by running out of the basement window into the back alley, and the police in the front of the building were actually firing upon the MOVE members who escaped, so a lot of them were just killed by policemen, even if they got out of the fire. And Ramona was with him. She helped him out, and then she tried to lift him up on this wall, and he slipped and fell back into the dirt and the wiring that had come down and the mud puddles. So she ran away, and there were two policemen who were guarding the back who saw them, and they had a discussion. And one of them said, "Be careful. I was in Vietnam, and some of these innocents are wired with bombs. It could be a trap." And the other policeman said, "He's just a kid. His fall was, was real." So he goes and rescues Birdie Africa, and he got an award actually for that. And Birdie was this naked little kid saying, "I'm hungry, don't shoot me." And he went on to live a fairly normal life. And then he had a strange accidental death when he was in his, about 4 years ago. Now today, the Move children learn about the atrocity, and they continue to demonstrate for animal rights and to free the Move 9. The Move 9 are 9 members who were given a life sentence because they happened to be in a house, a Move house in 1978 where the police raided and demolished with a bulldozer, and one of the policemen was shot, and there was no proof that any of the 9 shot him, and the Move claimed that the police just shot their own person by mistake, friendly fire. And they're continuing to agitate for their release. And I've spoken to some of the children who were born in prison from the prisoners and then joined Move. And I went to the March 13, 2015 rally in Philadelphia, which was 30 years after the 30, is that right? Well, anyway, so many decades after the 1985 fire. And I met the members, and there's still a very strong movement with a lot of supporters. And by the way, it's not a black nationalist movement, because there are a lot of white people in the group, and they intermarried. And the other thing about the group is they have conventional Christian ideas of family. So the leader was a monogamist married to Alberta, Africa, and they have like nuclear families within the larger communal family. Okay, now I wanted to look briefly at the Oneida Perfectionists. They're not exactly contemporary, but they're a very good example of a millenarian commune that practiced eugenics, and the children were the center of their millenarian aspirations. But when the group was persecuted and broke up, there was no violence because the leader was actually a very mature, enlightened person. He was a millionaire who gave all his money to the commune that he founded. And then when it broke up, he split all the funds between all the members equally. He made sure all the children could go to university, and he turned this religious commune into the Oneida silverware factory, where it's still, a very successful business. And many of the former members were now executives in this business. So it's partly because they had a very, reasonable leader who didn't say, let's all commit mass suicide because I'm not, my aims are not working out. So in 1887, this is a photograph taken in 1887 of the eugenics experiment, where 58 children were born who were believed to be spiritually, elevated. And basically it worked out that John Humphrey Noyes and some of his friends and brothers impregnated the youngest, prettiest girls. But anyway, in this group, before that, they had practiced male continence, which was a kind of semen retention, because he believed that if you store the semen in your body, it will preserve your health and make you and youth. And he himself, by the way, wasn't supposed to get old. And when he began to go bald and slightly deaf, it was a problem. And actually, he wasn't exactly the third coming of Christ, but he'd had this revelation that Jesus had come again at the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD or around there. And consequently, humanity was free of sin, but not aware of it. And what you needed to do was live together where everything was shared equally, and people were discouraged from sinning and selfishness. And then people would realize their sinless state, and of course this implied perfect health and longevity and so on. And one of the They also had unusual marriage system called complex marriage, where sex was seen as the supper of the lamb. So everybody had to share equally. And they didn't mention homosexuality, but the leaders made sure that people, rotated, and also that more spiritual people slept with less spiritual people to, help them along the path, which basically meant old guys got to sleep with young girls, of course. And the other thing is, they were very much against philopropagativeness, which meant attachment to your children. And if these stripper cults showed affection for their parents, they were warned of stickiness. And in fact, I'll tell you later on. Here's some pictures of the little children. Now, another thing they did was, he said that women are a female man, and he criticized the distinction between the sexes in the Victorian age. So the women, instead of wearing corsets and wraps in their hair and long, petticoats that had to be washed, they chopped off their skirts and wore pantalettes, and they chopped their hair and they wore no makeup. And they worked beside the men in gardening and farming, and the men worked beside them in the kitchen. So the idea is men and women should be friends, and they should work side by side. And the purpose of sex is friendship, not procreation. Okay, so this is just about the leader. And this book came out, in 1937 by Pierre Bert Noyes, who was one of the stirpiculture children, son of John Humphrey Noyes. And it's the most delightful book. He describes his very active, mischievous boyhood and makes fun of the beliefs and his sort of childhood rebellions. And he has this great sentence where he says, we children were supposed to be perfect and free of sin, but I think it was pretty soon the grown-ups started to doubt it. And when the group broke up, he was sent to university, and he became the big director of the silverware factory. He also became a politician, so he had a very successful life. He married one of the other stirpicult girls and had 3 children, and altogether, a very successful, psychologically healthy person. Okay, the next group I want to look is the Doukhobors, and they were infamous in the 1950s and 60s in Canada. There were a lot of newspaper reports on them. And they originally came from Russia. And, 5 minutes. Oh, okay, I'll skip and just, okay, basically they got in trouble because they're anarchists and they won't sign contracts and things. They won't send their children to school because they believed that reading and books were one of the roots of sin. So instead they would sing in choirs, and they had a huge oral history through their choirs. And so the children were taken away by the RCMP and put in a residential school where in fact they were abused, and later launched a class action suit, and they lost their Russian culture, and this is a big tragedy. So here's a case of, here are the men who they used to demonstrate in the nude because they believed that the skin was perfect, made by God, and that they wanted to be like Adam and Eve before civilization corrupted the human soul. And they also were arsonists. Here's the Living Book, which is what they call their Bible, which is basically a choir tradition, a choral tradition. And here they're at the horrible school where the parents are only allowed to talk to their children through barbed wire. Okay, unfortunately, we have to skip this really delightful, horrible. This was a Quebec man who claimed he was a Mi'kmaq chieftain and shaman, and he was very successful in Europe in getting a lot of money from different sources, and he started a March of Return, which was the idea was to walk around the entire planet and cross the oceans on a raft. He had to escape prosecution by going to Nicaragua, and he got in trouble for kidnapping children, hiding them. Anyway, it's an interesting case of a millenarian movement in which children died and were abused because they rejected modern medicine and they lived in teepees in 30 centigrade below weather, and extraordinary hardship, trying to be like, primitive Indians or something. Okay, finally, I just want to make my final point here. I've got some really cool little videos here. Okay, so my final point is that, first of all, you can't predict when children are in danger in millenarian movements, and you have to think about that very complex issue of how literal are they in interpreting their mythic prophecies. But one thing is clear from looking at these cases, that millenarian movements tend to be separate from society. They tend to raise their children in segregated childhoods, and this causes conflict with society, so that so in some cases you have raids on the groups, you have children taken away by social workers, and so children have suffered being taken away from their parents. Also, in some cases you have, violent deaths of children caused by negligence of law enforcement, and that some of the practices in these groups, which are the consequence of their millenarian beliefs, can be dangerous for some children. So, well, that's my point, really. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much. Just a reminder that we are live on the internet. There are several people watching us now.
Oh, no.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad you didn't tell me.
I know. I deliberately withheld that information. So, time now to ask Susan some questions if we have them. Could I ask you to put your hand up, and I'll come with the microphone so that you can put your question to Susan. Any questions? Oh, back here.
With the MOVE group, apart from the fact that what's her name, Africa, asserted that it was Ramona asserted that it was a religion, a lot of what you said just sounded like a radical vegan vegetarian commune rather than a religion. How sure are you that it actually was a religious movement, as distinct from just a radical vegan movement?
Well, there are three reasons. Actually, I met this young American researcher who's doing his PhD in Sweden. I don't know if you remember, his name is Eileen. I met him at London School of Economics at one of the Inform conferences, and he was doing his PhD on MOVE, and we had a discussion, and he said they're definitely a religion. The other reason is that I asked Ramona if they're a religion, and she said absolutely, and she talked about their beliefs in this, basically the spirit of the earth, which they see as female, and the idea that they have to honor that spirit and liberate her, which is why they tear up, asphalt and so on. And they bury their food and so on in the, they compost and so on. The other reason is that in a statement they made at the time of, right after the terrible fire in 1985, they said, people see us as terrorists, but we're not, we're a religion, and we have the right to, live our beliefs. So those are three indications that they're religion. But it's true, if you read about them, on Wikipedia or the internet, they're always seen as a radical political group. They're often seen as black supremacists, which they're definitely not. And although they have the last name Africa, which suggests that. So I would definitely say they're religion.
Anybody else? Thank you.
Yes, I was interested that you talked about the level of risk to children and the difficulty of the authorities in determining whether children were or were not at risk. But that seemed to apply only to being in physical danger. It was a good case there where the Doukhobors children, the Canadian authorities intervened on the basis that the children were being deprived of what the community at large regards as a basic human right, which is a child's right to education. And that kind of isolation, the deracination of children from their society, is itself surely a kind of risk. Just wonder whether you...
that really is...
It's this whole business of children really still not recognised as having rights of their own and still being regarded as chattels of their parents.
I see what you mean. This is a very difficult question. And I mean, there's a fine line between, the rights of parents to educate the children in their own faith and children being deprived by living in a sectarian, group. But it's also a question of culture. Like, our mainstream culture has decided this is the way to live. And they apply it to children in so-called cults, but they don't apply it, say, to children in the Hasidic movement in Canada. They don't accuse the Hasids of harming their children when they practice the bris, or they don't attack them for sending them to schools which make it impossible for them to earn a living if they happen to leave. But if they're in a so-called secte or cult, the idea is these children are going to want to leave someday, and what are they going to do? They have no, they won't be able to survive in society with their education. So it's actually a very difficult thing which you cannot really resolve, I don't think, or at least, on one hand you have Richard Dawkins saying that there's no such thing as a Muslim or a Jewish child. They're only children who are indoctrinated and their brains are stunted by fake knowledge, mythic knowledge, and that they're basically, he wants to get rid of Judaism and Islam and Christianity. On the other hand, there are extreme cases where children certainly are in some of these groups undernourished. Certainly in Echo V, which I didn't, a lot of children died because they were freezing cold, or there wasn't any food, or there was no medical care, or the mothers had stillbirths because they had to walk for 1,000 miles, and they didn't eat anything but roots and leaves, So there are extreme cases, but I think this is an ongoing debate, and you have to balance every case. In the way there's no answer.
It's interesting that the UK authorities are now increasingly expressing concern about the children of Haredi communities who are isolated and taught that Western society is the enemy, and so deliberately alienated, as you say, from the society that they're going to grow into. I think it's a growing awareness.
Yes,
which
the
I
same
think
thing.
is
Similar thing happened in Quebec recently, where 43-year-old man left the Hasidic community, and he said, I have 4 children, I only speak Yiddish and Hebrew, I can't get a job, and he sued the Quebec government for failing to give him an education. So now they're, closing down Orthodox schools, doing investigations, and before that they were very reluctant to, because, it was seen as like more persecution of the Jews. So